Lies can't hide forever. When a racist cop stops Lisa Carter on a quiet night, she expects trouble, but not a false charge that could destroy her life. Officer Bradley thinks he can silence her with threats. But what he doesn't know is that Lisa is already recording every word. He has the badge, the power, the system on his side. But Lisa has the truth. And tonight, the truth is about to take him down. The night air was crisp, the streets of Brentwood, a quiet suburban town, illuminated by flickering streetlights. Lisa Carter, a 26-year-old black woman, walked with steady strides, her hands tucked into the pockets of her hoodie. She had just left her best friend's house after dinner, her mind still lingering on their conversation about work, dreams, and the world's unfairness. Lisa wasn't paranoid, but she was aware of how things worked for people like her, how even in a so-called safe neighborhood, her skin color could turn her into a suspect. A low hum of an approaching police cruiser made her shoulders tighten. She ignored it at first. Maybe it was just another routine patrol. Maybe. But when the headlights flared brighter, slowing directly beside her, she knew better. Officer Bradley Monroe, a veteran cop with a long history of unchecked power, sat behind the wheel. He was the type of officer who saw himself as the law, not just a part of it. His cold blue eyes scanned Lisa with an expression that wasn't concern. It was suspicion. Lisa didn't flinch as he rolled the window down. She had been through this before. "You out kinda late, aren't you?" His voice was heavy with condescension. Lisa didn't stop walking. She owed him no explanation. "Just heading home," she said evenly. Bradley's car lurched forward, cutting her off, forcing her to halt. "Got some ID on you?" Lisa exhaled sharply. She knew where this was heading. "Am I being detained?" she asked, her voice steady. Bradley smirked. He liked this part. The control. The fear. "Just a routine check. You match the description of someone we're looking for." Lisa stared at him. Here we go. She had heard this before. Matching the description was code for, "You're black, and I need a reason to stop you." Still, she knew better than to resist. She had seen what happened to people who resisted. Slowly, she reached for her ID, keeping her movements deliberate. But even as she handed it over, she could tell this wasn't about identification. This was about power. Bradley examined her license, then took an unnecessary pause. "You from around here?" Lisa raised an eyebrow. He was holding her ID, her address right in front of him. He wasn't asking for confirmation. He was baiting her. Lisa held her ground. She wasn't going to play into his game. But then Bradley stepped out of the car, his posture shifting from casual to confrontational. "Let's do this the easy way," he said, cracking his neck. Lisa's heartbeat picked up. She wasn't sure yet, but she could feel it. He was about to set her up. The street was quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over the sidewalk where Lisa Carter walked, her pace steady, her mind preoccupied with the conversation she had earlier with her best friend. The night air carried a crisp chill, but it was nothing compared to the sudden wave of unease that crawled up her spine as the sound of a police cruiser rolling up beside her shattered the silence. Her stomach clenched. Not now. Not tonight. She didn't even have to look to know who it was. The car slowed to a crawl, matching her pace. The window rolled down and there it was. That voice dripping with fake authority, fake concern, real power. "Out kinda late, aren't you?" Lisa glanced over, already knowing what she would see. Officer Bradley Monroe, the infamous small-town cop who had a reputation for making people like her disappear into the system. He was the kind of officer who saw himself as the law, untouchable, above question. She swallowed her irritation. "Just heading home." Bradley clicked his tongue. "That's so?" His hand rested on the wheel, but his sharp blue eyes never left her face. Lisa kept walking. The car lurched forward suddenly, cutting her off. Lisa had to stop or risk walking straight into the hood. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Stay neutral. Stay alive. "Got some ID on you?" Bradley asked, stepping out of the car, his hand resting on his belt. Lisa felt a familiar weight press against her chest. She had done nothing wrong. There was no reason for this stop. "Am I being detained?" she asked evenly, standing her ground. Bradley smirked. He loved this game. "Just a routine check. You match the description of someone we're looking for," he said lazily. Lisa scoffed internally. "Yeah, I match the description. Because I'm black, and that's all you need." She took a slow breath and reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. She made sure her movements were deliberate, slow, obvious. Even though she had done this before, she wasn't about to give him an excuse. Bradley snatched the ID from her hand, glancing at it with fake interest. "You live around here?" he asked. Lisa frowned. Her address was right there. He wasn't asking for confirmation. He was baiting her. "You already know the answer," she said flatly. Bradley smiled. It wasn't friendly. "Where are you coming from?" Lisa bit the inside of her cheek. "Dinner with a friend," she answered. "Drinking?" There it was. Lisa knew the trap. If she said no, he'd call her a liar. If she said yes, he'd claim it was probable cause. She shook her head. "No, officer, just dinner." Bradley let the silence stretch. "You sure about that?" Her jaw tightened. "This is going south fast." Bradley took a step closer, closing the space between them. "Mind if I take a look inside your bag?" Lisa froze. Here it was. The real move. The setup. If she refused, he'd call it suspicious behavior. If she handed it over, he could plant something inside. Drugs, a weapon, anything. Lisa felt her pulse spike, but her voice was even. "I don't consent to a search." Bradley's grin widened. "Oh, we've got a smart one, huh?" Before she could step back, his hand was on her arm. Lisa jerked away instinctively. That was all he needed. "Resisting arrest," Bradley shouted, his grip tightening as he slammed her against the hood of the car. Lisa gasped, pain shooting through her ribs. "What the hell?" Bradley reached for his radio. "I got a suspect resisting arrest. Send backup." Lisa's heart pounded against her ribs. This is happening. She pressed her palms against the cold metal of the car, her breath coming in quick bursts. She knew what came next. She had seen too many stories like this. Bradley leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "You should have just walked away," he murmured. Lisa's stomach churned. "What do you want?" she managed. Bradley chuckled. "Here's how this goes," he whispered. "I call in my report. Say you resisted. Maybe threw a punch. Add a little assault on an officer charge." Lisa felt her hands curl into fists. "You'll do a year, maybe 2. Enough to lose your job. Your future." His voice was almost mocking. Lisa closed her eyes. He thought he had all the power. "You apologize, say you overreacted, and this all disappears." Lisa's breath was shaky. She could feel the rage burning inside her, but she didn't let it show. Not yet, because Officer Bradley had just made one fatal mistake. Lisa slowly turned her head to the side, just enough to meet his eyes. And then she smiled. For the first time, Bradley hesitated. "What the hell are you smiling about?" he snapped. Lisa turned her shoulder slightly, revealing the glow of her phone screen inside her bag. Still recording. Bradley's expression changed instantly. Lisa's voice was deadly calm. "You just confessed to a crime, officer." Bradley's smirk vanished. He reached for her bag. But it was too late. Lisa had already pressed send. Her video was uploaded. Within seconds, it was out of his hands. Bradley took a stumbling step back, realizing what had just happened. His face turned pale under the flickering streetlight. Lisa stood up straight, brushing the dust from her sleeve. "You were right about one thing, Officer Monroe," she said, her voice sharp as steel. Bradley blinked. What?" Lisa's eyes burned with fire. "You should have just walked away." The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around Lisa Carter's wrists, biting into her skin as Officer Bradley yanked her arms behind her back. The sharp click-click of the cuffs echoed in the empty street, but it was the smirk on his face that made her blood boil. "You really thought you could pull one over on me?" Bradley sneered, tightening his grip on her shoulder as he shoved her harder than necessary against the patrol car. Lisa's palms pressed against the cool surface of the vehicle, her breath controlled, her posture unshaken. She could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what was happening. But she didn't struggle. She didn't beg. She knew the truth was on her side. Bradley leaned in, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You'll regret this, sweetheart. Maybe not now, but once that record sticks to your name, let's see how long that tough attitude lasts." Lisa lifted her head slightly, just enough to look him in the eyes. There was no fear in them. "You sure about that?" she said, her voice calm. Bradley frowned. Lisa knew something he didn't, because the moment he slammed her against that car, her video had already been sent. Lisa had moved fast. The second Bradley grabbed her phone, she had managed to swipe up on the screen, hitting send on her message to Maya, her best friend, her lawyer, her lifeline. It wasn't just a text. It was the entire recording of what had just happened. Every word, every threat. Bradley's corruption laid bare in digital proof. As Bradley tightened the cuffs, she knew Maya was already watching it. She knew that within minutes the recording would be out of her hands and into the world. And there was nothing Bradley could do about it. Bradley shoved Lisa into the back seat of his cruiser, slamming the door behind her. He strutted to the front seat, whistling as he radioed in. "Suspect in custody. Bringing her in now," he said, his tone smug. Lisa stared out the window, her breath even. The weight of the handcuffs was still there, but she felt lighter somehow, because she wasn't the one who needed to be afraid. Inside the station, Bradley pushed her forward. The other officers barely looked up. To them, it was just another routine arrest. Lisa was taken to a small holding cell, cold and dimly lit. The metal bench beneath her was uncomfortable, but she didn't care, because she could already hear the distant sound of officers whispering outside. Something was happening. By the time Maya arrived at the station, everything had changed. Lisa's video wasn't just leaked, it was spreading like wildfire. The moment Maya had received it, she had uploaded it onto social media, sent it to news outlets, and forwarded it to civil rights activists. And now, it was everywhere. Trending. Now, justice for Lisa. The video of Officer Bradley framing a black woman, lying and threatening her with a false arrest, had spread across every major platform. Twitter was on fire. People were furious, calling out police corruption and demanding justice. Facebook groups were sharing the video, tagging politicians, local news stations, and civil rights lawyers. Celebrities were speaking up, amplifying Lisa's voice to millions. And in the middle of it all, the police department was scrambling. Bradley was standing in the hallway when his phone buzzed. He frowned and pulled it out. The first notification was a text from an unknown number. "You're finished." The second notification was a link. He tapped on it, and his entire world came crashing down. Because there he was, on camera, in high definition, admitting to framing an innocent black woman, blackmailing her and abusing his power. The blood drained from his face. He turned to the other officers, but they were already looking at their own phones. His colleagues were watching, his superiors were watching, and suddenly, for the first time, Bradley wasn't the one in control. An hour later, an officer approached Lisa's cell. He looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. "You're free to go," he muttered. Lisa didn't move at first. She wanted to hear him say it again. "What was that?" she asked. The officer sighed, unlocking the door. "You're free to go. Charges dropped." Lisa stood slowly, feeling every single eye in the station on her. As she stepped out, Maya was already waiting, her phone still in hand, her expression fierce. Lisa turned, scanning the room until her eyes locked with Bradley's. He was standing there, frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his face pale as a ghost. Lisa smiled. He knew what was coming next. Outside the station, reporters were already gathered, cameras flashing, microphones extended. "Lisa, how do you feel knowing the whole country is behind you?" one journalist shouted. "Do you want Officer Bradley arrested?" another asked. Lisa took a breath, then faced the cameras. "This was never just about me," she said, her voice clear. "This is about every black person who has ever been silenced, every innocent person who has been falsely accused, and every corrupt cop who thought they could get away with it." She looked straight into the lens, her expression deadly serious. But not anymore. The crowd erupted into cheers. The courtroom was packed. The energy in the air was electric, a mix of tension and anticipation as people gathered to witness what had become the most talked about case in the country. Lisa Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it in ways Bradley Monroe never could have imagined. Across the room, Bradley sat stiffly, his hands clasped together, his jaw set in a hard line. His usual arrogance had faded, replaced by an unspoken fear. He wasn't the one in control anymore. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Phillips." Everyone stood as the judge entered. His gaze swept across the room, stopping briefly on Lisa, then on Bradley. There was no warmth in his eyes, no patience for whatever excuses were about to come from the defense. He settled into his seat, and the moment he gave the nod, the prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, today, we present irrefutable evidence that Officer Bradley Monroe abused his power, engaged in racial profiling, and attempted to cover up his actions by blackmailing my client." The jury members shifted in their seats. Some of them already knew the details. They had seen the video. The entire world had. But now everything was about to be laid out, frame by frame, word by word. Lisa sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap as the prosecutor turned to her. "Ms. Carter, please describe, in your own words, what happened on the night of your arrest." She lifted her head, her voice clear and unwavering. "Officer Monroe stopped me without cause, fabricated a false accusation, and when I refused to submit to his abuse of power, he attempted to blackmail me." Murmurs rippled through the room. The judge's gavel slammed once. Silence returned. Lisa didn't take her eyes off Bradley. He was sweating now. "Let's allow the evidence to speak for itself," the prosecutor said, stepping aside. The lights dimmed slightly as the video from Lisa's phone began playing on the large screen at the front of the courtroom. The room fell into complete silence. Bradley's own voice echoed through the speakers. "Either you shut up about this, or I'll make sure you end up in jail with a criminal record." Gasps filled the room. A woman in the jury covered her mouth. Someone in the audience muttered, "Oh my God, you should have just walked away." "I'll say you resisted, maybe even assaulted me. You'll lose everything." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The jury members exchanged looks, their faces shifting from shock to anger. The weight of the moment settled into the room, thick and inescapable. Lisa didn't move. She had already lived through this moment once. The difference was that now she wasn't the only one witnessing it. Now Bradley was the one exposed, his lies laid out for the world to see. Bradley's attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this recording—" The judge held up a hand. "I think we all heard enough." Bradley sank lower in his seat. His defense attorney had no choice but to call him to the stand. He stood stiffly, his usual confidence crumbling. "I was simply conducting a routine stop that night," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "She matched the description of a suspect." The prosecutor leaned forward. "What description?" Bradley hesitated. She was wearing dark clothing." The prosecutor arched an eyebrow. "Like thousands of other women in the city?" Bradley's jaw tightened. And what about the threats you made? Do you deny making them?" Bradley cleared his throat. "That recording is taken out of context." Lisa stood up. "Tell us, Officer Monroe, what's the correct context for threatening to frame an innocent woman?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The judge slammed his gavel. Bradley was visibly unraveling. Lisa turned to the jury, her voice steady. "If I didn't record that video, I would have been another forgotten case. Another statistic. How many more people has he done this to? How many innocent black men and women are sitting behind bars because their word wasn't enough?" The jury was motionless. No one blinked. The judge let out a slow sigh, adjusting his glasses as he addressed the jury. "You may now deliberate." It took them less than 10 minutes. The foreman stood, his voice firm. "In the case of Lisa Carter versus Officer Bradley Monroe, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." A thunderous cheer erupted from the audience. The judge slammed his gavel again, but there was no silencing the wave of relief that swept through the room. Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The judge turned to Bradley, his voice sharp. "Officer Monroe, your actions have disgraced this institution. I hereby strip you of your badge, and you will be sentenced accordingly." The color drained from Bradley's face. The bailiff approached, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, the same ones he had locked around Lisa's wrists that night. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Bradley turned to Lisa, his lips curling into a last-ditch sneer. "This isn't over." Lisa smiled, slow and victorious. "Oh, it is." The gavel struck one last time. "Court adjourned." Lisa stood, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her as reporters shouted over each other. She didn't answer, didn't stop. She just walked forward, through the crowd, through the noise. She had already said enough. The courtroom doors swung open, and the flashing lights of a dozen cameras lit up the hallway like a strobe. Officer Bradley Monroe, once untouchable, was now the one in handcuffs, his face pale, his eyes darting wildly as reporters bombarded him with questions. "Officer Monroe, do you have anything to say about today's verdict? Do you deny the accusations against you? How does it feel to lose your badge?" Bradley kept his mouth shut, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he was grinding his teeth. He had spent years believing himself above the law, convinced that a badge granted him the power to control whoever he pleased. Now he was just another disgraced man in uniform, being led away like a common criminal. Lisa Carter watched from the top of the courthouse steps, her heart steady, her breath even. The moment should have felt surreal, overwhelming, but it didn't. It felt right. She had fought. She had won. And not just for herself. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted into applause as Lisa stepped into the sunlight. Supporters held up signs with her name, with slogans demanding police reform, with words that carried weight far beyond this moment. Justice for Lisa, justice for all. A young black girl, maybe no older than 15, pushed through the crowd, her eyes shining with admiration. "Ms. Carter," she called out, "can I shake your hand?" Lisa looked down at the girl's trembling fingers, at the hope in her eyes. She reached out, clasping her hand firmly. "You can do more than that," Lisa said with a small smile. "You can stand up, you can fight, you can win." The girl beamed, squeezing Lisa's hand before running back to her mother, who gave Lisa a look filled with something unspoken. Gratitude. Lisa turned to face the cameras, knowing she could no longer walk away from them. This was bigger than her now. A journalist stepped forward. "Lisa, after everything that happened, do you think justice was truly served today?" Lisa took a breath. "Justice isn't about one case," she said. "It's about making sure this never happens again." The crowd cheered, but Lisa wasn't done. She turned toward the large banner draped across the courthouse steps, the one demanding an end to police abuse and racial profiling. The world had seen Bradley Monroe fall today, but the system that created him, that was still standing. Across town, the police department was already in damage control mode. Press conferences were being scheduled, statements were being drafted, and high-ranking officials were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. The public outcry was impossible to ignore, and within hours of the verdict, the police commissioner announced an internal review of officer conduct. A task force would be created, new training implemented, and racial bias within law enforcement directly addressed for the first time in the city's history. None of it would erase what had already happened. None of it would take away the countless names that had never made it to a courtroom. But it was a start. Lisa didn't need to celebrate. She didn't need to revel in Bradley's downfall or soak in the praise of the people who had supported her. She had done what she came to do. She had spoken up, she had fought back, and she had refused to be silenced. As the reporters continued shouting her name, as the cameras kept rolling, Lisa stepped forward. Not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a woman who had demanded justice and won. And she wasn't done yet. Lisa Carter stood at the courthouse steps, the weight of the past weeks settling on her shoulders. She had walked into this battle alone, armed with nothing but the truth and the courage to fight back. Now she wasn't alone anymore. The crowd stretched beyond what she could see, a sea of people holding signs, chanting, demanding more than just one guilty verdict. They wanted real change. The energy was electric, a movement growing stronger, louder. Lisa had never set out to become a symbol, but looking at their faces, she realized that's exactly what she had become. Reporters swarmed around her, microphones pushed toward her, voices clashing as they hurled questions at her. "Lisa, how do you feel about Officer Monroe finally facing justice? What would you say to others who have been victims of police misconduct?" Lisa kept her posture straight. her hands steady. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't afraid. She had been waiting for this moment, not for attention, but for the chance to say something that mattered. A journalist in a dark suit stepped forward, lowering his mic just enough to make it personal. "Lisa," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "how does it feel to expose a corrupt cop?" Lisa paused, letting the question hang in the air. She could feel the weight of it, the way people held their breath, waiting for her answer. But the truth was, this had never been about just one cop. Bradley Monroe was a symptom, not the disease. Her lips parted, her voice calm, but firm. "I didn't expose him," she said. "The truth did, and the truth will keep winning." The crowd erupted, cheers breaking out, voices chanting her name. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment, spreading her words beyond this place, beyond this city. The truth had won today, but Lisa knew this fight wasn't over. She turned, stepping away from the microphones, away from the questions, walking down the courthouse steps into the crowd. Hands reached out for her, people thanking her, telling her how much this meant, how they had been watching, hoping, believing. Somewhere in the distance, the police commissioner was making a statement, promising reforms, pledging a new era of justice. Lisa didn't need to hear it to know it was happening. Public pressure had forced their hand. As she walked through the sea of people, a young black girl caught her eye. She looked no older than 13, standing with her mother clutching a homemade sign that read, "Truth wins." Lisa smiled, walking over to her, kneeling slightly so their eyes met. "Keep fighting," Lisa told her. "Always." The girl nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. Lisa stood, inhaling the crisp air, knowing that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And the truth? It would never stop winning.